Hello, friends, and welcome. Before we get into today's story, I want to thank you for being with us. These bedtime stories are designed to soothe you, awaken your memories, and gently lull you into the night. If you enjoy these moments we spent together, your support means everything to us. Please take a moment to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell so you never miss a story. I'm also interested to know where you're listening from. Leave a comment below and include your city, state, or even country. It's always special to see how far these stories spread and to feel the connection between all of us. Your comments, likes, and shares help keep this channel alive and growing so we can bring you even more stories that warm your heart and soothe your mind. Now, let's make ourselves comfortable, take a deep breath, and immerse ourselves in the memories of today's hero together.
It was a quiet evening, the kind that settles softly around a house after the day's noise fades. I was sitting on the porch of my home, an old rocking chair creaking beneath me, a warm cup of tea resting between my hands. The fading light painted long shadows across the wooden boards. In my lap was a worn magazine, one of those classic car issues, glossy pictures of shiny engines and polished chrome. Then I saw it, a car that stopped me cold. Sleek lines, a familiar shape that somehow brought back a flood of memories I thought were locked away. The smell of oil, the hiss of the air compressor, the heavy thud of a wrench striking metal, all came rushing back like it was yesterday. I closed the magazine slowly and looked down at my hands that once fixed engines, replaced worn-out brakes, and breathed life into cars that others had given up on. Those hands had been my tools and my pride for over 40 years. I remember when it all began, a curious boy in a small town, fascinated by the rumble of engines and the scent of gasoline. I was the kid who took apart old lawnmowers, who hung around the garage watching the mechanics with wide eyes and grease-streaked fingers. My apprenticeship was hard-earned. Long hours, endless learning, the smell of burnt rubber and metal filings always close by. But it was honest work, real work, the kind that shaped me as much as I shaped the machines. Tonight, sitting here, I feel the weight of those years. The friendships forged under harsh lights and in oily garages, the laughter shared over greasy sandwiches, the challenges when a stubborn engine refused to start, and the triumph when it roared back to life. Life moved fast back then, like a speeding car on an open highway. Unexpected turns, detours, and moments that felt too big for words. But through it all, my work was a constant. It grounded me. Now, as the sun dips low, I feel that old fire flicker inside. The life of a mechanic wasn't just a job. It was my story. And maybe, tonight, I'll tell it again. Because some memories don't fade. They just wait for the right moment to start running again. I grew up in a small town where everybody knew everybody else's business and their cars. My father wasn't a mechanic, but he had a knack for fixing things around the house. He had this old toolbox, battered and stained, that he kept under the porch. As a kid, I was drawn to it like a moth to flame. I remember the first time I picked up a wrench. It was rusty and heavy in my small hands. I tried to turn a bolt on our family's old Ford pickup. It didn't budge. I pulled harder, sweat running down my forehead, and finally heard the satisfying creak of metal moving. I felt like I'd just conquered the world. School was never my favorite place. I'd rather be in the garage down the street, watching Mr. Jenkins work his magic under the hood of cars. The smell of grease mixed with the warm scent of hot engines was my comfort. Mr. Jenkins saw something in me, took me under his wing, and taught me the language of engines, the clinks, the hisses, the hums and roars. I learned fast. There was something almost poetic about turning a pile of metal and wires into a machine that could carry people wherever they wanted to go. Every car had a story, and it was my job to listen, understand, and fix what ailed it. By the time I was 16, I was already the go-to kid in the neighborhood for small repairs, changing oil, fixing brakes, tuning carburetors. I'd get a few bucks here and there, but more than money, I was hungry for the work, the hands-on work. That hunger never left me. It shaped my life, gave me purpose, pride, and a place where I belonged.
And tonight, looking at that car in the magazine, I can still feel the spark of that first wrench turn deep inside me, lighting up memories of greasy hands, hard work, and dreams forged in the glow of a garage's fluorescent lights. Starting out as a young apprentice was tougher than I ever imagined. The smell of burning rubber, the clang of steel hitting steel, the thick cloud of smoke from the welding torch. It was a world that demanded respect and grit. The garage was hot in the summer and cold in the winter, filled with the constant hum of engines and the sharp hiss of compressed air. I remember my first full day on the job like it was yesterday. The foreman handed me a greasy rag and said, "Keep the place clean, kid. You'll learn everything else by watching." But it wasn't just about cleaning. It was about being ready. Ready to learn, to get your hands dirty, and to prove you belonged. There were mornings I'd wake up before dawn, aching from head to toe, but my mind was already running through the day's tasks: brake jobs, oil changes, tuning engines, fixing carburetors, diagnosing mysterious noises. Every car was a puzzle, every problem a challenge that sharpened my skills. The work was honest, but never easy. Sweat mixed with grease stained my clothes and skin, and the sharp scent of gasoline clung to me like a second skin. The guys I worked with were a brotherhood forged in the heat of the shop. Old-timers with decades of stories, teaching me tricks that books couldn't hold. They told me about the best way to listen to an engine, how a knock could mean a dozen things, and the feeling you got when you fixed a car that no one else could. Those friendships were real, built on shared struggles and laughter over greasy sandwiches during lunch breaks. Outside the shop, life moved fast. The country was changing. Muscle cars roaring down highways, new technologies creeping into the industry, the smell of change mixed with exhaust fumes. I had dreams too, of owning my own garage one day, of building a life with Mary, who I met at a diner on a rainy night and who became my rock through all the twists and turns. Every night, after long days, I'd come home smelling of oil and sweat, but with a fire in my chest. The work grounded me, gave me purpose. Even when the world outside felt chaotic, the garage was a place where I could fix things, make things right. Looking back, those early days weren't just about learning a trade. They were about learning who I was. A man built on sweat, sparks, and unyielding determination. And no matter how many years have passed, that fire still burns, quiet, steady, reminding me of where it all began. As the years rolled on, the garage became more than just a workplace. It became the backdrop to my entire life. There were mornings when I'd wake before the sun, already thinking about the stack of cars waiting for repair. And then there were evenings spent wiping grease off my hands, driving home through quiet streets to Mary's warm smile and the sound of our children's laughter. Balancing work and family wasn't easy. Long hours in the shop meant missing school plays, birthdays, even quiet dinners. There were times Mary had to fill in, taking care of the kids on her own while I chased deadlines and urgent calls from customers. She never complained aloud, but I knew the sacrifice ran deep. Her patience and love kept me grounded,
reminding me that the life I was building was more than engines and repairs. Our kids grew up with the smell of oil and the sounds of the garage in their ears. Sometimes they'd tag along on slow Saturdays, helping me hand tools or simply watching with wide eyes as I worked. I wanted them to understand the pride that comes from honest labor, the satisfaction of bringing a broken machine back to life. The work itself changed too. The muscle cars and classic pickups of my youth gradually gave way to sleek imports and electronic systems I never imagined when I started. I learned to adapt, to keep up with new tools and technology, always hungry to stay relevant. Some days it felt like the world was speeding ahead without me, but I held tight to the basics. The feel of a running engine, the sound of a well-tuned carburetor, the trust between a man and his work.
Friendships from the shop grew into lifelong bonds. We shared more than just a paycheck. We shared hardships, losses, and triumphs. I remember the day we gathered around when old Tom retired after 40 years, a ceremony filled with laughter, tears, and stories told with reverence. That's the day I realized that this job was more than a trade. It was a community, a family. There were losses, too. Friends taken too soon, accidents that shook the shop to its core. Each scar and story a reminder of the fragility of life and the importance of cherishing every moment. Through it all, Mary stood beside me, a steady light in the chaos. Now, as I sit here remembering, I see how those years shaped everything, the good, the hard, the unforgettable. The garage wasn't just where I fixed cars, it was where I built a life, learned to love, and found my place in the world. And for that, I'm forever grateful. By the time the kids were in their teens, money was still tight, but we'd learned how to stretch it. Every summer, Mary and I would pack up the station wagon, a '76 Chevy we kept running long past its due, and take the family on a road trip. Not to resorts or big city hotels, no. We'd head west, toward dusty highways, roadside diners, and wide-open skies. Those trips became our tradition. I always took 2 weeks off, closed the shop with a handwritten sign taped to the window, "Gone exploring, back soon." It felt like the only time I ever let go of the wrenches and deadlines. And once we were on the road, with the hum of tires and Mary's soft humming up front, I became someone different. Not just a mechanic, a father, a husband, a man seeing the world with fresh eyes. We stopped in little towns where people still waved to strangers, motels where the lights buzzed and the soda machine clunked out cold glass bottles. I'd show the kids old engines at truck stops or let them climb up into abandoned tractors. They'd roll their eyes, but I saw it, the flicker of curiosity, of respect. At night, we'd sit under stars so thick it made your chest ache. I'd tell them stories from my youth, not the hard stories, not yet, but the ones with adventure, laughter, and lessons I'd learned with greasy fingers and a stubborn heart. Mary would rest her head on my shoulder, and for those quiet moments, the world felt perfectly still. One summer, my middle child, David, asked me if I ever regretted not going to college, not becoming an engineer or a businessman like some of his friends' dads. I looked at him, then at my hands, calloused and marked by decades of work. And I said, no, because I got to build things, fix things, raise you, and I never missed a sunrise I didn't earn. That answer seemed to settle something in him, maybe even in me. The open road gave me perspective, reminded me that life wasn't about how shiny the car was, but how far you could get on a full tank and a little faith. And when the vacation ended and we rolled back into town, sunburned and smiling, I always felt ready again, ready to reopen the garage, to turn the key in the door and step back into the life I had chosen, the life I had built with my own 2 hands. And if you ask me now, all these years later, those dusty highways and fading sunsets are some of the finest chapters of my life. It's a strange thing, the day the garage goes quiet, you don't notice it right away. It creeps in. First, the days get shorter, not by the sun, but by the number of cars that roll in. The calls slow down. Your regulars start bringing their grandkids instead of their own cars. And one morning you realize you haven't heard the clang of a dropped wrench in weeks. I remember the exact moment I knew it was time. It was a Tuesday. Mary was in the kitchen making her second pot of coffee, the one for sitting, not for rushing, and I was lacing up my boots when my hands paused, just floated there. I looked around the quiet house, the worn-out boots, and the wall clock I'd checked 1,000 times before, and I said out loud, "Maybe today I don't open the shop." Mary didn't flinch. She just poured me a cup and said, "Then don't."
That silence wasn't empty. It was earned. After 40 years of hammering out dents, rebuilding transmissions, and keeping the town rolling, I had nothing left to prove. Still, walking into that garage the last time was like stepping into a memory. The smell of oil and old rubber, the tools lined up with military precision, the creak of the stool I always sat on during lunch, all of it felt like a time capsule. I didn't cry. Not then. But I stood there for a long time, fingers trailing across the workbench, each groove and scratch a story. I packed a few things. My favorite wrench, a Polaroid of the shop in '84, the little rusted bell that jingled when someone opened the door. I left everything else. Because that garage wasn't just mine, it was part of the town. And maybe, just maybe, someone younger would pick up where I left off. That afternoon, Mary and I sat on the porch. I didn't know what came next. I only knew the sun was warm, and I could hear the wind instead of engines. For the first time in my life, the world wasn't rushing past me. I was just still. And in that stillness, I felt the weight of every mile I'd driven, every nut I'd tightened, every goodbye I hadn't known I was saying. It was the sound of a life well lived. And damn, it was beautiful. After the shop closed, I found myself waking up at the same hour. Old habits die hard. The sun would just be brushing the tops of the meeples, and I'd be sitting there, coffee in hand, boots laced, with nowhere to go. But eventually I found a new ritual. Sunday mornings became sacred. That was the day I'd take the old Ford out for a drive. Not to the store, not for errands, just to drive. Like I did when I was 17, before oil changes became a job and engines became a paycheck. I'd pick a direction, north, east, didn't matter, and I'd roll, windows down, radio low, roads I hadn't driven in years. Back roads that had once led to old clients' farms, now quiet and grown over. I'd pass barns collapsing into themselves like tired men, and gas stations with rusted pumps and sun-faded signs offering Pepsi for 35 cents. Sometimes I'd talk to myself, or maybe to the car, or maybe to the younger me who once dreamed of stock cars and racing stripes. Once I stopped at an old diner, one of those places that still had pie under glass domes and coffee served in chipped mugs. The waitress looked about my age and smiled like she knew exactly what kind of man I was, the kind who tipped in cash and always said thank you twice. That day, I sat by the window for almost 2 hours, just watching cars go by. Young couples, loud trucks, parents with kids screaming in the back seat. Life, just passing. I felt invisible, but not in a sad way. More like weightless. And you know what? I liked it. There was no grease under my fingernails anymore. No calluses, no busted knuckles. Just scars now. Silent stories in the skin. My hands were softer. My heart too. I started bringing a notebook on those drives. Nothing fancy, just jotting down little things. Memories, thoughts, questions I'd never asked. Like, when did I become the old guy behind the wheel of a classic car? And Why did that thought make me proud? Those ghost roads, those long stretches of silence, they taught me something. I wasn't chasing anything anymore. I was remembering. And sometimes, remembering is enough to fill a whole day with meaning.
It had been nearly 5 years since I'd closed up the shop for good. You'd think the smell of oil and metal would fade from memory. But some things cling to you, like the scent of old leather or the sound of a socket wrench clicking in place. One evening, my grandson came over. He's taller than me now, voice deeper than I ever expected. Wears headphones around his neck like they're part of his body. He sat down at the kitchen table and looked at me with those clear eyes that reminded me of my daughter when she was his age. "Grandpa," he said, "what did it feel like, being in the garage every day? Did you ever get tired of it?" I laughed before I answered, not because it was funny, but because I'd asked myself the same thing 1,000 times. "You know," I said, "it was loud. My back always hurt, and there was never enough light, and I smelled like grease even in church. But it was mine. Every job was a puzzle. Every car a story." He didn't look at his phone the whole time I talked. That meant more than he'll ever know. I took him out to the shed where I kept some of my old tools. It smelled like steel and memory. I handed him my torque wrench. Heavy, cold, reliable. He turned it in his hands like it was something holy. "Feel that?" I asked. "That's a life built one bolt at a time." He nodded. Before he left that night, he hugged me tighter than usual, and when the door closed behind him, I stood there with my hands still in the air. That moment, that silence, was the sound of a chapter closing. Not sad, just finished. And in the quiet, I whispered, "Goodbye, old life. You did good." It had started to rain just after dinner. Not a storm, just that steady, soft drizzle that taps gently on the roof like a familiar song. I sat by the window, nursing a lukewarm cup of coffee, watching the droplets slide down the glass like tiny trains on invisible tracks. The house was quiet. Too quiet. My wife had passed away 3 years ago, and though I'd grown used to the stillness, there were nights when it sat heavier than usual. That evening I was thinking about the old 1967 Chevy Impala I used to work on. Not a customer's, my own. Metallic navy blue with a deep, chesty growl that made your ribs hum when you turned the key. I had bought it as a wreck. Bent frame, seized engine, no hope. Everyone said I was wasting time. But I'd stayed late after shifts, piecing it back together like a wounded soldier I couldn't give up on. Took me 2 years. Every bolt had a story. Every part was earned. I still remember the first time I took it for a drive at dusk, down an empty back road, radio low, windows cracked. That scent of gasoline and freedom. That soft rattle in the dash I never quite fixed. I didn't care. I was 29, and the whole damn world still had sharp corners and loud music. Tonight I thought of that car like an old friend you haven't seen in decades. You wonder where it is now, who's driving it, if they love it like you did, if they even know the kind of hands that once brought it back from the dead. I went out to the garage. The light flickered a bit when I turned it on, always does in the rain. I ran my fingers over the wooden workbench, the grooves, the stains, the tiny burns from welding sparks. My tools were still arranged like I'd be back tomorrow, though I hadn't touched most of them in years. Then I noticed an old Polaroid pinned to the corkboard. Me and Rick, my best friend and co-mechanic, holding greasy burgers in one hand and a transmission in the other. We looked like idiots. Happy idiots. He died young. Heart attack at 42. I remember the sound of the impact wrench the day I heard the news. It kept whirring even after I'd let go of the trigger, like my hands hadn't caught up to my heart.
I sat down on the wooden stool, the one with the cracked leather cushion, and just breathed. Listened to the rain, to the whispers of the past hiding in every rusted wrench and oil-stained rag. People think retirement means rest, but no one tells you how loud the quiet can be, how the echo of a dropped bolt on concrete can bring you back 20 years in an instant. I closed my eyes and let myself drift, not to sleep, but into memory. And in that moment, surrounded by steel, wood, and ghosts, I wasn't an old man anymore. I was just a mechanic, deep in the work, deep in the rhythm, trying to make something run again. Somewhere in the middle of those quiet years, when the shop was more memory than workplace, and the days started feeling longer, not because there was more to do, but because there was less that demanded sweat, I had a call from Tommy. Tommy was the kid who used to hang around outside the garage with his bike propped against the curb, eyes wide when I rolled out a restored Mustang or replaced a transmission. He wasn't family by blood, but he was the sort of kid who saw value in grease-stained hands. He'd grown up, got a little scuffed up by life. The last time I saw him, he was standing across from me in the doorway, arms folded over a jacket too thin for the Indiana spring wind, and he asked, quiet, "You still fixing things, Jack? I could use some work. I need to learn from someone who knows." That line stuck in me longer than any lug wrench. I'd been stubborn about letting go. The world had changed. Computers talked to me through dashboards. Engines whispered diagnostics in codes I didn't always trust. There were younger guys with tablets and software subscriptions who could tell you the resistance on a sensor without ever smelling a burned clutch. I'd felt that shift before, like a gear that had been meshed for decades, clicking out of alignment. Pride said, "You can still do it." Wisdom, the part that lived in my bones now, said, "Maybe it's time to teach." So I took him in. Not in full swing, not with promises of glory, just a battered stool beside mine, a rag, and the slow reveal of how to feel an engine's heartbeat. I didn't start with sensors and code. I started with sound. "Listen," I'd tell him, "engines talk. You learn the pitch when they're happy and the cough when they're not. Computers are useful, but they'll never replace what your hands remember." Tommy had questions. He had impatience too. He'd watch me reach for a socket and take an extra beat to adjust, my fingers not as quick as they once were, and he'd sigh like the world was waiting. I didn't mind. I remembered what it was to be young with fire in your chest, waving away the slow parts and wanting shortcuts. So I pushed back. Not hard, just enough to make him listen. We worked on old cars that other shops had written off. A Chevy with a seized engine, a family van that had been the lifeline for 3 generations, an old pickup with a dented fender that belonged to a widow down the street. Tommy started bringing his own oil-stained notebook. He'd write down what I told him, then scribble some of his own thoughts in the margins. Little diagrams, questions, the way he'd describe the sound of a loose belt, like a tired breath. He was learning. I felt it in the way his hands moved more confident, in how he'd pause, listen to a rattling valve, and then smile when we traced it to a worn lifter. He wasn't just learning to fix cars. He was learning the rhythm of something that keeps people moving, that holds families together, that keeps a father from missing dinner because his van broke down and the kids needed a ride. And as he learned, I felt a strange relief. The wrench didn't feel as heavy anymore, not because the work was lighter, but because it wasn't all resting on my shoulders. I found myself giving him the old torquing tricks, the don't over-tighten the trailing arm bolt unless the road is going to dance, the stories about why we always kept a rag inside the glove compartment when the dash started sweating on hot days.
One evening, after we'd finished a stubborn brake job on a car that smelled like old leather and memories, Tommy said, "You ever think about why you kept going so long, even when it got harder?" I looked at the ceiling rafters, the same ones I'd seen for decades, when oil dripped and the radio played low. I thought of Mary laughing at me when I came home late, smelling like gasoline and cinnamon from the diner pie we'd split. I thought of the kids growing up with the hum of engines as background music. "I guess," I said slowly, "I was afraid if I stopped fixing things, something would stop being real. Like the world would slip and nothing would hold." He nodded like he understood, but I know he didn't fully. Not yet. The day came when the shop threw that little retirement thing for me. I didn't plan it, I didn't want to fuss, but they did it anyway. Tommy helped quietly with the setup. There were old crew members, their sons, a couple of ladies who'd brought their cars in for years, and the mayor, bless him, who read something off a paper where he had written my name wrong twice before getting it right. They gave me a plaque, wood with brass, for a lifetime of keeping us rolling. Tommy stood beside me when I said a few words. I didn't talk about the money, or the hours, or the broken parts. I talked about those hands, about how the only thing that ever mattered was showing up, tightening the bolt, and then making sure your kid, whether by blood or by neighborhood, knew how to do the same. After the crowd thinned and the lights were turned off, Tommy stayed behind and handed me a small, wrapped box. Inside was a socket set, new, but not flashy. On the lid he'd scratched with a screwdriver. "For the stories you still got left." That night I went home and sat on the porch, the weight of the years settling in me like a comfortable coat. The stars came out slow. I held that little set in my lap. I wasn't sure if I'd taught him everything. Maybe I hadn't. Maybe he'd teach me something new in return. But I knew this. The life of a mechanic wasn't a straight road. It had been full of detours, dead ends, and unexpected pit stops. And now I had a better map, one where the wrench didn't just belong to me. It was passing cleanly to someone who would keep the engines humming when I was gone. That's the hardest kind of letting go, and the most peaceful. By the time I hit my late 40s, everything started moving faster. Cars were changing, the tools I used were becoming digital, and sometimes I just stare at an engine and think, what happened to the days of carburetors and timing lights? But I adapted, not because I loved computers under the hood, but because I had mouths to feed, and because deep down, I still loved figuring things out. The shop I worked in had expanded. What started as a small two-bay garage turned into a full-service center. I was the senior tech by then, mentoring younger guys who didn't know what a spark plug looked like before the scanner told them it was misfiring. Some listened, some didn't. But I always tried to teach them with the same patience my old boss Lou had shown me. Feel the machine, I'd say. Don't just read it, feel it. There was one kid, Isaiah, sharp mind, big heart, but always rushing. One night he stayed late, trying to fix a brake line on a '99 Civic. I found him under the car, cursing the rust, and instead of scolding him, I laid down on the concrete next to him, handed him the flare nut wrench, and said, "Let's do it together." That's the thing about teaching. It brings you back to the basics, and sometimes that's where the peace is. Home life wasn't always smooth. My wife Diane had gone back to school to become a nurse in her 40s. The kids were in and out of the house, growing up too fast. The garage became my quiet place, even on weekends. I'd rebuild old engines for fun, sometimes with my youngest Ellie, who surprised me with how well she could handle a ratchet. I remember one summer Sunday. The garage doors were open, the radio played soft country, and I was under a '67 Mustang while Ellie handed me tools. The scent of cut grass and engine grease mixed in the air. Diane stood in the doorway holding 2 lemonades, and I just looked around and thought, this is it. This is the life I wanted.
The years between 50 and 60 moved like a slow train through open country, steady, heavy with meaning, and somehow more beautiful the older I got. My hands had changed. The scars, the thickened knuckles, the stubborn calluses, they told stories even I had forgotten. stories of dropped wrenches and busted knuckles, of fixing a customer's car at midnight because they had a funeral to drive to in the morning. My back ached more, my eyes weren't what they used to be, but my instincts, they stayed sharp. I could still tell what was wrong with the car just by the way it shuddered pulling into the lot. When the company introduced a mandatory digital diagnostic system, tablets, auto-sync reports, cloud-based updates, it was the first time I truly felt out of place. I wasn't afraid of change, not exactly, but I missed the intimacy. Machines used to talk to you. Now they whispered into a computer and you just read what it told you to do. Retirement started appearing in conversations. Not loud, not directly, but soft suggestions. "You've earned a break," they'd say. "Time to enjoy life." As if what I was doing wasn't life. As if I hadn't already spent my whole life enjoying the smell of oil, the sound of a motor coming back to life, the quiet joy of helping someone get back on the road. But I started thinking about it. Diane had been talking more about visiting the Grand Canyon, about spending a month with her sister in Oregon. Ellie had left for college by then, and the house had grown too quiet. The shop wasn't the same anymore. My boys had moved on, one to Texas, the other into tech. And then came the day I didn't expect, the final engine rebuild. It was an old Chevy Bel Air. The owner wanted it done for his father's 70th birthday. I spent weeks on it, slow and deliberate, treating every bolt like it mattered more than the last. When I turned the key and that engine roared like it had been waiting years to speak again, something inside me sighed. A deep, tired, grateful sigh. I drove it around the block once, just me and the wind, and when I parked it back in the bay, I knew. That was the last one. Retirement didn't come with a bang. No grand farewell, no big party. Just a quiet morning where I handed the keys to the shop over to a younger guy named Jordan. He was smart, kind, and eager. Reminded me of myself at 25, hungry to prove something, unaware of just how long and winding the road ahead would be. Diane and I moved out to the countryside a year later. A small house with a wide porch, the kind where you can hear the crickets at night and see the stars clear enough to remember just how big the world really is. I built a small workshop behind the house, not to fix cars, but to tinker. Radios, clocks, old toys from flea markets. I needed something to keep my hands busy. I always will. The days slow down in the best way. I learned to enjoy mornings again. Coffee with the woman I've loved since high school. Long walks under trees that bent like they had stories to tell. We visited the Grand Canyon. We sat in silence at the edge of it, overwhelmed not by its size, but by the sense of time it carried, like it had seen everything, and still remained. Ellie started calling more. Then came grandkids, 2 of them. They don't understand what I did for a living. Not really. They just know Grandpa used to fix things. That seems enough for now. Sometimes at night, I sit on the porch and hear the distant sound of a train passing. The low rumble, the whistle slicing the silence. It doesn't stop here. It never did. But it reminds me of the rhythm of life I once knew. The steady motion, the waiting, the leaving. And sometimes I dream. Not of the future, not anymore, but of the past, of that first engine, of long summer nights under the hood, of grease on my jeans and pride in my chest. I see the faces of customers who trusted me, the laughter of coworkers now long gone, the shape of a life well lived, defined not by fame or fortune, but by honest work and deep love. So if you ask me now, at nearly 72, if I'd do it all again, the answer is simple. In a heartbeat.